Hola, bienvenidos a este webinar que hemos titulado La nueva llave, el impacto de la biometría, donde hablaremos de las tendencias del fraude y de las tecnológicas que ayudan a combatirlo. Yo soy Valentí Canadell, director regional de Mitek en el sur de Europa y Latinoamérica, y estoy muy contento de que hoy nos acompañe Briggs, nuestro vicepresidente y general manager de Mitek Identity. Hola Chris, ¿qué tal estás?
Hola, bien, gracias. It's nice to be here today. Thank you so much, Valentí.
Gracias a ti. Aunque Chris habla muy bien español, haremos el podcast, el webinar debería decir, en inglés y para que nadie se pierda detalle de esta conversación, que seguro que será muy interesante, lo vamos a subtitular, así que no os preocupéis. So,
Perfecto.
Chris, we continue in English. You know that this is the first of a series of capsules that we are going to send out to the world once a month. It is aimed at companies that are interested in fraud trends and technologies, but also at individuals. So my first question is, do you think that it's important to talk about this? And if that's the case, then why?
Good question. Fraud is fraud is real. I would start by saying you have all probably experienced it yourselves. I've experienced it myself personally. I was actually the victim of a SIM swap scheme in the United States about 6 months ago. So not only does it impact people, it impacts people very personally. I know that sounds a little bit repetitive, but the fact of the matter is it's not just a problem that's being experienced by business, which it is, but it's also being experienced and causing harm to individuals, to consumers, and to people that are really trying to deal with it on a day-to-day basis. And that harm can come in some very, very distinct ways. So it not only comes in the form of people potentially losing money or being the victim of a scam, but it also means that in many cases they have their identity stolen and or compromised, which isn't a single event, but continuously then causes issues over a period of time, which then continues to drive not only frustration, but fear and concern. I guarantee that everybody that's listening to this podcast has either had this happen to someone they know very well or even themselves. And that is simply a fact of the world that we live in today. And the reason for talking about this is not necessarily to drive more fear or consternation. I don't want people to leave saying, what are we going to do? I want people to know that there are ways that this can be addressed, both personally as well as from a business perspective. And that, in fact, companies like Mitek, where I work, we think about this every single day. What do we actually do to tackle the problem of fraud, particularly identity fraud, as people are either buying a new phone or going to a bank and taking out cash, whatever that transaction is. It's about raising this awareness for organizations and for consumers themselves.
I couldn't agree more, and that's why we thought it was a good idea to initiate this series of content capsules. Every month, we are going to invite someone that we find interesting, either experts or victims or different stakeholders of this ecosystem. You're the first one, and because I know you, I know that you have been working in different companies in one way or another, fighting fraud using technology over the last 30 years, I would say. So not calling you old, just experienced. But,
Thank you, Valentí.
So can I ask you to share a bit your personal journey, how you got here, and also how you have seen fraud evolve during these last years?
Of course. So since my university days, I've really always been focused around the convergence of how consumers use technology and how technology impacts consumers themselves. So not to date myself, from the early stages of what was eventually going to become the internet and through the dot-com boom to today, it's all been systems, technologies, customer journeys that really allow consumers to leverage technology in a much more effective way. The way that I typically describe it is if you think about being a goal to teach either in my case, my mom or my grandmother, how to actually use a piece of technology in a way that provides not only value, but it's simple and straightforward in the way that it's implemented. That's what I've spent most of my career doing. And that really has come through a number of different roles. So I started in consulting. So I spent about 12, 13 years working in consulting with some of the largest systems integrators in the world. And then I shifted to working with a number of different startups. Those were based both in the United States, but also in the Netherlands, in the UK. I did quite a bit of work in India, Malaysia, and Mexico. So really have traveled through a number of different countries, seeing a lot of the dynamics for how different organizations try to tackle fraud, but also the software and the analytics and the data that they're actually using to do that. And right now, this is culminated in my being the general manager at Mitek for our identity practice, where I think about this every single day when I wake up, not just in one region, but I think about how people deal with this globally almost every single day and how we as a company can help those consumers improve their interaction with technology and basically make the process more safe and secure.
Absolutely. And so the second part of the question was on the evolution of the fraud itself. I mean, I've not been in the industry for as long as you, but even myself, I have experienced the rise and fall of solutions like active liveness, where we ask people to do very strange things like blinking and smiling and moving the head around to prove that they are
Yeah.
alive. And then the fall of that because of the customer friction and moving into passive liveness solutions powered by artificial intelligence and so on and so forth. So from that perspective, have you also seen a big evolution of the fraud trends and the technology since early in the 90s to today?
Yeah, so you're perfectly correct that one of the things that we see is that there's this trend associated with technologies where they started and technologies of where they're going, to the point where we're using our face like no one would have expected in the past. But if you back up and say, why is this the case? Why are we using these more advanced technologies? And we'll talk about those in a minute. But it is because fraud has become very complex over time. When I think about the origins of fraud based on my own experience, it used to be that someone, for those of you who are experienced with either physical vouchers that are being used for payments, checks in the United States and the UK, the fraud would have been sort of, I'm going to write a check on Friday and someone cashes it on Monday, knowing that I don't actually have all the money in my bank account. To evolve to today in that same industry, where you've seen a growth in the ability to be able to write and duplicate and effectively create a fake document at astronomically fast paces and at a very expensive price point. So technology for the fraudsters has become cheap and easy to acquire, which means that it's driving a lot of innovation, quite frankly, in the fraud space for different types of fraud schemes. So fraud schemes like what we see in the marketplace around synthetic identity has always been someone sort of taking a piece of plastic and basically scratching out someone else's name and replacing it with their own name. And while that exists today, what we're seeing is not only is that happening digitally, which is much, much more difficult to actually detect and determine how that's going, but it is actually becoming systematic in nature, meaning that there are machines that can basically churn these new digital identities out at a relatively low cost of cents per document. And that then drives more adoption and more proliferation of those types of documents into the space overall, which means more bad guys to catch.
And it's interesting what you're saying there, how technology is also helping the bad guys, or how technology can be used for the wrong reasons, and how easy it is that these threats become global threats because technology is available just like that everywhere in the world, right? So you having a global view, because in the end, Mitek is a global company, so you see what's going on in different regions. What are the biggest trends that you're observing, and are they happening all at once, or do you see fraud spreading from one place to the other, these techniques spreading from one place to the other slowly?
Yeah, so it's a bit of both. So the first thing that you have to realize when you go into the space is that fraud has no borders. Like fraud, the idea of actually having someone who is being a bad actor in any transaction, whether it's going to the bank or actually buying a new phone or whatever it actually is, procuring new financial capabilities over time, it doesn't care whether you sit in the United States or Europe or South America or Southeast Asia. Basically, it can cross borders indeterminately. And by the way, as we've had certain restrictions around the crossings of borders, say the introduction of Schengen over time, and then with the consolidation of the EU over the last 20 years, you've seen it actually go across borders even faster because the normal, let's use a border check as an example, the normal process of going to a border check and actually having someone change your passport has evolved over time that you don't have to show your passport when you're going from, let's say, Italy to Spain or France, or even traveling by air or road. In both cases, you're allowed to travel freely within the EU. The problem that you have is that the way the data is treated within each one of those locations and the way that fraud evolves in each one of those places can be different, but it will actively move across locations. Let me give you an example. It's not uncommon for fraud to group into specific fraud schemes. One of the ones that we're seeing in the space right now is pretty common around money muling. So what will happen is that you will basically have money that originates in one location being deposited in an account in another location, which naturally requires to both a issuing and a receiving bank, and typically they are in different locations. And what will happen is that location where it's being received will migrate to the country, whether it's inside the EU or outside of the EU, that has the least restrictions on someone coming up and setting up a new account. So, for example, if you're looking at depositing something from the EU into, say, a UK bank account, the UK may not be as familiar with the types of document and or the types of data that you're using to prove your identity as you would if you were sitting in Spain, for example. And we see this all over the place. You will also see that when fraudsters find a particular opportunity within a particular bank, that they will communicate via their own communication channels, typically through the dark web, as to which one of those banks are more susceptible for those types of fraud. And you will see what I like to call fraud clumping. I know it's not so much of a technical term, but basically the fraudsters will basically aggregate around specific vulnerabilities within specific organizations at a specific point in time. And then what happens is once that organization has the ability to be able to more or less effectively shut down that, say, backdoor that's been opened up and or create less of a vulnerability, then they will move to the next bank who hasn't done that, or alternatively will move to the next form of fraud. So yes, it does vary and it does migrate, and you will see specific, like I said, clumping activities where they go after the least common denominator in trying to follow the fraud through specific markets.
I totally agree. That's the same I see at a regional level within Southern Europe and Latin America. Exactly the same. You were talking about Schengen, European Union. These are terms that are very familiar to us, and we know how the regulations affect the different member states and how the regulations are actually adapted to each state in a slightly different way. I know it's a very generic question, but if I would ask you about the biggest differences that you see at both sides of the Atlantic, at both sides of the pond, between the US and the European Union, what would you say?
In terms of fraud, specifically, we are seeing that there are differences in the way, well, there are two things. There are differences in consumer perception of fraud. There are actually differences in the way that financial institutions and other organizations see that fraud. And then there are differences in the regulatory framework around what you can and can't do to be able to detect, prevent, and implement fraud schemes. And some of those are required and some of them are not required. So, for example, in the United States, there's a complex series of standards and regulations around things like AML, which are enforced by local organizations within the U.S. market, like FinCEN, which is part of the U.S. government. You will see that type of regime implemented in different countries. So, for example, in the Canadian market, you'll see FinTrack. And in the Spanish market, you'll see other players that are enforcing rules and regulations around AML. But the specific ways that those are implemented are quite different from one location to the next. In the Canadian market, there's been a recent push for what is basically called multi-factor authentication around dual testing within AML to say basically you have to prove at least 2 or 3 different forms of identity for someone that's coming into the front door and either onboarding and or making transfers into an account. That has only recently come into play within the last 3 or 4 years, whereas I would argue that in some of the other markets, it's probably been more prevalent. The other thing you have to manage between the US is the fact that each one of the nation states within the EU actually are legislated by privacy and to some degree some distribution, particularly in the payment space, that is pan-European. So with the introduction of GDPR and PSD2, you're seeing more and more regulatory action and the recent trends in and around the privacy acts that have come into the EU as well that supersede in many ways what we're seeing in the US market that actually not restrict your ability to be able to trap the fraud, but make you have to take certain steps around consent, distribution of data, ensuring, in fact, that there's transparency in the way that the data is actually being used and how it's being implemented. So there's the standards and the regulations. There's the way that it's actually implemented. And then I would say that you're probably seeing this implementation of different types of technologies from a digital perspective being more prevalent in some locations than not. For example, in the US, one of the fastest growing parts of fraud is check fraud. People are basically taking a check and they will either acid wash it and they will rewrite it, or they will basically create a new identity document to substantiate the name of the person that's on that check. Versus what you see in Europe, the fraud will be more centralized around using a digital identity or using an identity that has been digitally manufactured in some type of onboarding process. Not to say that you don't see that in the United States, but the fraud vectors for, let's just say, big banks are slightly different within the various markets based on their specific target, the clientele, the key market segments that go within those banks, and typically the way that they have their customers engage with them. For example, in the European market, and I would say in some degree in the UK as well, but also in some of the other markets like Southeast Asia, they're very accustomed to the use of digital transactions. Something as simple as taking your phone, tapping to make a payment is super commonplace in places like Spain, but only now becoming the norm of what you see in the United States. And then if you're thinking about the fraud vector behind payments, then slightly has to be different to detect payment fraud in the Spanish market that's being used on a tap versus in the US market where the payment vector is really about someone using a credit card where you didn't necessarily sign it, card not present. C&P is one of the big vectors for fraud in the US in addition to check fraud. So yeah, it's very different based on where you go and how it's implemented, and then the consumer behaviors around how they think about interacting, particularly with payments and financial institutions around financial transactions.
Super interesting. Super interesting overview. So actually, if I may summarize, so the key is fraud is determined by the local consumer habits. So in the US, you use a lot of checks, so fraudsters use that as an attack vector. Not so much in Europe. But then, if technology is available globally and fraudsters are able to play globally and just look for the country that has the least resistance, then the role of regulators is actually important because they are the ones that make the difference.
Very important. And I would say, in addition to the regulations, the standards that are being applied from a technology perspective to detect the fraud. So you see different regimes in different locations that say in order to detect fraud, you should be looking at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. In the US, you're typically using for digital identities a NIST standard, which is level of assurance 1, level of assurance 2. And you'll typically see that as I need to take this document, this document, this document, and they have to be non-fraudulent in order to be able to prove an identity in these types of transactions. And those vary based on the type of transaction. For example, crossing an international border, as you might expect, takes a much higher level of assurance and therefore requires a much higher standard than necessarily going down the street and paying for I don't know, paying for a beer in cash. It's a very, very different type of transaction, has different types of fraud and risk associated with it. And because of that, those standards are applied in different regions differently. But going back to the point that you were making, Valentí, which I think is super applicable, and that is fraud doesn't know any borders, and the technology can cross the borders. And the technology combined with fraud allows the fraudster to find the best place to be able to apply the fraud at a specific point in time. There's an emerging trend in the space that I've heard quoted. It's not my quote, but I do believe it to be true, that you're seeing more and more around the applicability of what we call machine on machine. Mm-hmm. And this is the whole idea that if technology is cheap for the fraudsters, and banks or other types of institutions, telco providers, have to also use technology to detect fraud, what you're engineering is basically a machine that is creating fraud and a machine that is detecting fraud. And they're basically constantly at war, trying to battle who is going to be able to get through, how the bad guy's going to get through, and then how are you going to find out who the bad guys are on the other side of the spectrum.
So it's not your quote, but you do quote a lot. You tend to say, the past is not the future, which is one day I will get T-shirts for the team with that sentence. What do you foresee? I know you don't have a crystal ball, but what do you foresee as the future of fraud? A lot of generative AI, or where do you see this going?
Clearly, generative AI is going to play a role in the future. And we're already starting to see that because fraud has exploded and become more complex around things like injection replay attacks. So people are moving from physical documents to digital documents. It only exacerbates that over time. And then as technologies become more cheap, like GPT-4 just came out today, that it's going to be more widely used overall to be able to create both benefit to society overall, as well as prevent good people from being able to execute good transactions, or the reverse. Basically, it enables the fraudsters to be able to be more on the cutting edge at a lower price point than ever before. So the complexity is going to do two things, really three things to the market. First of all, consumers and organizations alike are both going to have to raise their vigilance around an understanding and awareness of what is fraud. So more understanding, better technical details dispersed through a larger number of clients that we're seeing in the market today that are starting to adapt to it. Not only is it becoming more complex, but it's actually becoming more frequent. Like I said at the beginning of the podcast, what we're going to find is that it's highly likely that at some point in the very near future, everybody on this podcast will be a victim of some type of fraud, whether it's an account takeover or whether it's someone scams you out of money. That will happen. And by the way, the fraudsters will continue to evolve. So fraud is not going away. It's only going to become more threatening and more frequent. And that level of awareness that we had just talked about is a key to being able to understand, is this something as simple as an email phishing for something, and if I click on it, it's going to install a nefarious object on my phone or on my laptop, is something that people need to be aware of. But then broader picture, I think what's going to happen is that you will gradually see the replacement of the current forms of identity as part of transactions, morphing into something that is much more holistic in nature. It's not going to just be about a passport or an ID card. It will be about a combination of having different data points about you as an individual. So, Valentí, in your case, it would be you live in Barcelona, maybe you work at Mitek, maybe you have then an identity document of some type that goes with that. And then there's a way for organizations to be able to corroborate that data in such a way that it proves that you are who you are at a specific point in time. So it's not just about a document. It's about what I like to call a holistic identity. And that holistic identity is about, in many ways, your footprint through various institutions with whom you've worked over time. And then beyond that, because there's a lot of frequency associated with fraud, we're starting to emerge into a time where that holistic identity even degrades in usefulness over time. The analogy that I typically use is when you buy a car, if you've ever bought a car before, and you drive that car off of the car lot, that car is worth anywhere between 10 to, in general, 35% less the first day off you drive it off the lot. Why? Because it could potentially be in a wreck, because you've already driven it for 40 kilometers, because the value intrinsically associated with that car being new or being the same way that it was when you bought it. Think about identity in the same way. We can prove that Valentí is who he says he is at a given point in time when he opens a bank account with CaixaBank in Spain. But 30 minutes after he walks out the door from CaixaBank, someone could, in fact, either digitally or physically get his ID, and they could take control of it. And the likelihood is that with more frequency in fraud, that's going to happen. So fraud your identity has a half-life, meaning it's going to degrade over time. So what we're seeing emerge in the marketplace is this whole concept that you'll see from some of the analysts. It's called PKYC, persistent KYC, or the ability to be able to have an identity that is whole and is continuously checked over time so that you don't constantly have to prove who you are. Organizations by default will know who you are, provided that you give them consent to be able to access that data. And then the third major factor that we're going to see over time, and this one is a little bit farther afield, is the move from identity as being something that may be controlled by a third party to one that is being controlled by the consumer themselves. Consent management is becoming more and more of a topic within the space. So it's this idea that you consent to how your identity is managed, and you will likely even have the ability to be able to manage your identity yourself, whether that's through your device or through communication with some type of third party that holds it for you. And there are a lot of regimes in the space that are coming up with how they manage that technically, either on their side or on the consumer side. But the fact of the matter is, this idea about consumer controlled identity is going to be far more of a focus area as we're moving forward. So consumer centered identity, the fact that you have PKYC, and the fact that we're having to create a more holistic identity overall are the three key trends that I really see over the course of the next 2 to 5 years.
Very good. Which actually links very well with the title of this webinar, as la biometría como la nueva llave. Indeed, because
Yes.
this refreshment of the identity is very linked exactly to that, right?
Exactly. So you'll see biometrics as one of the key factors that helps you create and persist an identity over time with less friction, but also you have the ability to be able to control it, because as much as there may be fear of the use of biometrics because it does represent what we call personally identifiable information, or PI or PII in the space, it can be used to be able to manifest fraud if put in the wrong hands of the wrong person at the wrong time. The simple fact of the matter is it is one of the surest ways to be able to manage your identity holistically across multiple transactions. And it is one of the most safe and secure.
Absolutely. I was thinking that most of the audience today will probably be from Spain, and you have been here meeting some of our key customers. I know that you want to meet more, and they also want to meet you, so it's a perfect match.
Fantastic.
Can you share your first impressions of the customers you've met, but also about the market overall?
Yeah, it's a very, very interesting market, because in many ways, I think that the external perception for coming from the UK or the United States or Canada or even other places is that it may not be as sophisticated. But the simple fact is, my observations is that the Spanish market is quite sophisticated in many ways. And they've been able to actually make some leapfrog advancements in the way that technology is implemented, both around fraud, but also more broadly around identity than, say, other markets. Let me give you a couple of examples. The one that I referenced earlier is quite true in the Spanish market. That the Spanish ecosystem has been very comfortable with payments via tap, which are validated and verifying the identity through different types of fraud techniques for a long period of time. Much longer than you've seen in the US. and probably to a certain degree more than and longer that you've seen in other countries like the UK. Now, I know there's a bit of controversy around whether that's actually true or not, but the simple fact of the matter is that if you're a consumer and you fly from the United States and you fly to Spain, what you will see is you will see an acceptance of tap or payments, simple payment transactions at every level, from all the way from a euro all the way up to 300 or 400 euros or more, being easily accessed at all points of purchase by simply just being able to use your phone and a point of sale device. I would say that that's only beginning to emerge in some of the other economies. Why can you do that in Spain and you can't do it in other places? Because there's a very, very sophisticated banking system behind that actually allows for the payment mechanisms to be able to run through rails that, although they are not real time in terms of physically within seconds, they do have the capacity to be able to support those payment transactions in near real time, which is not necessarily the case in some of the other markets as well. I would also say if you're looking at the financial institutions as a whole, they are more familiar with and acceptance of the 2 points that we just talked about. They are far more versant in this idea of using other forms of identity vectors to be able to detect fraud. So you're seeing the emergence of biometrics across the board. And this idea of consent and consent management is quite strong in the EU as a whole, but also in Spain specifically. There's a significant emphasis on the ability for a consumer to manage their own data as it's being passed around. At the very least, the ability to understand what it's being used for and how it can be both leveraged as well as how it can be deleted over time. I would also point to the telcos and the use of the similar type of technology within the telecommunication space. It's also very, very sophisticated, and their ability to be able to adapt to different types of processes, both in store, but also online, as well as with a mobile device. And overall, the ability to be able to infuse mobile channel communications into the daily lives of the consumers is much higher than you're finding in other geographies. I would pattern Spain a little bit closer to some of the advancements that we're seeing in some of the more advanced mobile economies, like in Southeast Asia, if you're looking at places like Korea, Singapore, organizations like that, or countries like that, as much as other ones.
Yeah, I guess as technologists, we always hope that it goes faster than it does, but indeed, I agree with you. Having lived in different places, I totally agree. Um, the past is not the future, and the past of Mitek is also not the future of Mitek. So, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yep. So we at Mitek are looking at the future, much like I described where the trends are going, to be more holistic, focused on identity, really thinking about the consumer as the center point of what's going on. And then that identity is an object that persists over time. All right, great. Those are the market dynamics. But what does that actually mean for us as an organization? It means that we are also changing to integrate new and different capabilities around aggregating data around the consumer with their consent, and the creating the scores and the models around how that actually creates a proof point, not only at one point in time, but also multiple points in time of who a potential consumer could be. So, for example, Valentí, you would work with one of our clients in the future on getting not just one piece of evidence, like an identity document, as we've done in the past, but multiple different data points that would then be uniquely qualified to be able to identify you as an individual, both now as well as various different transaction points in the future. And then even be able to access services within a bank or a telco or other types of organizations once you've created some type of biometric binding, to be able to persist that using your face or your voice or other types of biometrics that don't necessarily rely on on-device support, but rely on true identity support. Moving away from necessarily using Face ID for either an Apple device and or for an Android device to being one that is more holistic and attached to a true identity versus just being a representation of someone who has deployed a face onto that actual mobile phone itself. And we're supporting that transition over time. What does it mean for us internally? It means a change in the way that we think about identity. It means integration of new and different types of data science. As I talked about machine versus machine, advancing our machine learning capabilities and really pushing into a space where we move beyond just thinking about whether this document is not a fraud to thinking about whether the vision of Valentí at a given transaction that is being presented is fraudulent or not, and moving beyond this concept of accept. I like to say move from accept to moving to approve, moving to a smooth relationship with the consumer so that our customers get a better understanding of who that person is knocking on the digital front door or in branch, unifying that experience together into one core set of capabilities, and then providing an easy access point for the consumer over time. Now, these are things that we've done insularly over the course of the last, I would say, 7 to 10 years, but we are quickly advancing by integrating different core capabilities in the space to reach these objectives over the course of the next 6 to 18 months.
Exciting.
Yeah, very exciting.
I have the last two questions for you because I know how busy you are, and we are really thankful for having you here. So the first, the first one is for a long time, when I look at this ecosystem, it is very clear that all the stakeholders want to be on the side of fighting the bad guys. And I think about corporations like us, technology providers, but also institutions, call it banks, call it telcos, call it insurers, whatever. And obviously the people that suffer it, right? We are all on the same side, but for some reason, we are quite bad at building consortia that all together collaborate to fight fraud. What's your view on that? Why does it fail constantly? And are you optimistic about moving more in this direction of collaborating for the good reasons?
So there have been collaborations over time that have actually focused on solving these types of problems. One of the most traditional ways of looking at it is if you look at organizations like Interpol in the EU to be able to find the bad guys physically. That type of model will undoubtedly have to move from the physical realm to the digital realm. The question really isn't if, it's a question of how, and then eventually in what manner, sort of what is it going to look like, and then when. We're already starting to see this emerge in some of the economies. So, for example, in the UK, there are some signal sharings between many of the larger financial institutions in the space where they basically say, if we're detecting fraud, we have the ability to be able to get an understanding of who is fraudulent in the space. We also see that to some degree informally in some of the other markets where they will, for example, share collections. So you've seen this with credit bureaus over time, where basically that is a type of consortia that is going to have to advance to be able to incorporate fraud data. And many of these organizations that exist today are incorporating fraud data in a digital format, whether it's law enforcement or whether it's a credit bureau or whether it's a third-party independent organization. What isn't clear is the degree to which some of the larger institutions will be open to sharing some of this data directly, which means an opening up of the relationships to realize that Big Bank 1 and Big Bank 2 might have to work together to be able to solve a specific type of fraud that actually hits them both at the same time or hits Big Bank 1 first. And then we know as soon as they tackle that vulnerability, it slides from Big Bank 1 into Big Bank 2. So there are a number of different sort of areas that are starting to emerge in this space. And the jury is really still out as to what exactly those will look like. But I in particular am optimistic that the only way to be able to tackle this over time is through the introduction of both some lightweight as well as potentially some very heavyweight consortia where some information is shared between major parties in the space, and then more broadly allows for better coordination between each one of the organizations that are responsible, both from a law enforcement perspective, but also from the prevention of fraud overall in the private sector as well.
Very good. So now the last one, I promise, since this is aimed at corporations, but also at individuals, any last advice for individuals to be as safe as possible in this dangerous world?
First is don't be afraid. It is dangerous out in the space. There are things that you can do. The thing that I typically would say is stay vigilant. In my particular case, I was able to detect the SIM swap scheme that had occurred to me because I had set up a number of different alerts with my providers. So I was actually able to see what was happening when it was happening. And most of the providers in the space, if not all, due to some local standards and regulations that are put into place, are required to provide consumers with these types of alerts around what is actually happening with the account to prevent fraud. My advice specifically is set them up, watch them, make sure that you see them, and then respond to them. If you have a question, don't feel as though you can't pick up the phone and ask the provider, why did this happen? What is happening? In my particular case, the provider did not know at the time what was happening, although I suspected, as I've been working in the industry for years, that this was what was happening. The simple fact of the matter is that I was able to get ahead of it, and I was able to understand it and change the dynamic to prevent whole-scale fraud occurring on all of my accounts overall. So vigilance, understanding, awareness, and don't be afraid to ask. It's like many of the things that you see when you're traveling that say, if you have a question, ask a question. If you see something that's suspicious, ask somebody about it. In many cases, there are going to be others as part of that process that have either the same question that you do and or experts that you can turn to as a consumer that can help you better understand what is going on overall. Because without that, it can just be a very confusing place for many people. And you just need to get better awareness and education to be able to come up on that curve.
Very good. Thank you very much, Chris. Thank you very much for your time. And for the audience, muchas gracias por seguirnos y por ver este episodio. Sacaremos más. Una vez al mes intentaremos traer a la gente, si puede ser, tan interesante como Chris. Así que estad atentos y no dudéis en dejar en los comentarios temas de los que os gustaría que hablásemos, o incluso personas a quien nos gustaría que invitáramos a este espacio. Muchas gracias. Thank you, Chris.
Muchas gracias, Valentí.
Y nos vemos pronto.
Nos vemos.
Chao,
Gracias.
Chao.